All right, we are live. Hey, everybody. As people log on, it's been exciting for me to have on special guest Jerry Harris today. We've got a couple things that he's going to be able to teach us about, but let's bring him on and I'll let him tell you who he is and what he does. So, hi, Jerry.
Hi, Austin. How are you?
Good. Glad to see you. And why don't you tell us a little bit? What's your background, the church that you're at, and what you're doing with the Christian Standard today?
Okay, I've been the senior pastor at the Crossing for 24 years. The Crossing is a multi-site church. We're in 3 different states. We have 11 locations. Right now, attendance-wise, we're around 5,500. That's about 80% of where we were before the pandemic. Something big that just happened, January 1st, I turned over leadership to a guy that's on my team. He's been on my team for 16 years, and I've invested a lot into him. And so now I'm the teaching pastor, and he's the senior minister. So I'm actually working for my protege, which is I'm really enjoying, as a matter of fact. So that's kind of what I'm doing as far as church goes. And I've been involved in a number of other things, but one of the things I think that's pertinent to what we want to discuss is, for 5 years I've been the publisher of Christian Standard magazine, and it's part of Christian Standard Media, which is they're kind of the custodians in the independent Christian church of the Restoration movement, its history, its values, its fruits, and that's a really unlikely thing for me to do, but it's kind of by divine appointment. You know, I don't really that kind of came to me, and I've really enjoyed doing it. So I like to tell a lot of stories that relate to the Restoration movement now, and I get to do that in different environments. And those are kind of the 2 bigger things that I'm involved in. I don't know if you want me to elaborate on anything else.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's important for people in our area of the country that may not have heard of the Crossing, that the way that happened, kind of your vision there has been, I don't know, a teaching point and a blueprint for other churches to do multi-site, multi-locations. And I know the first time I'd heard of the Crossing, I was like, wow, what are they doing there? And anyway, I don't know how much you care to share, but you guys are over a couple different states, even you cross state lines.
Right. We're in Missouri, Iowa, and Illinois, primarily in Illinois, and we are what Illinois people would call downstaters, which means we're a long way away from Chicago, and about 2 hours north of St. Louis on the Mississippi River. So you go across the Mississippi, you're in Missouri. So right. That's where Quincy, Illinois is, and that's where I started, and it was a little church of about 230 when I came, and we were a mobile church. We were in a high school. A lot of people can relate to that. Set up and tore down every week, and then bought a community college. Had an opportunity to do that, and we grew into that. Got somewhere between, I'd say, 1,750 and 2,000 in attendance, and I was really wondering, this was back in 2005, 2006, and I was wondering, well, what are we going to do in a town that's not growing? We're in these, what I call micropolitan communities. The community of Quincy is 40,000. It's a static community. It's never been much less than that or more than that in the last quarter century. So it seemed like if we were going to grow, it probably wasn't going to be a lot more in Quincy. with 2,000 people coming to church and 40,000 people in the community. And I heard about a church in Oklahoma that was doing multi-site, and I'd heard of multi-site before. It was a really new idea back in 2005. And that church in Oklahoma, everybody knows now is Life Church. And we went down there, spent some time with their people, got kind of behind the scenes. And I really believed we could reproduce that in micropolitan communities. And so that's what we've been doing ever since. So back then, it was a pretty crazy, innovative thing to do. At the time, people didn't even think multi-site was really church. Some of the things that people say about online now, they were saying about multi-site then. And we expanded in Macomb, Illinois. That was our first multi-site location. And then Kirksville, Missouri after that. And then another location in Quincy. Then we launched 2 locations simultaneously, one in Hannibal, Missouri, and one in Pittsfield, Illinois. And we just kept going. Eventually, one in Keokuk, Iowa. We've had a couple that we've closed back up. So we're not batting 1,000, but we've done really incredible. And
to say the least,
we're in an area that's 10,000 square miles. So like if you like our service radius is about 200 miles wide. So if you drive in to our area, you're not going to drive out for at least 3.5 hours.
It sounds like some places in western Kansas and western Nebraska.
It's kind of like that. And we're like equally distant from like every major city. So like if you were looking at Kansas City and you were looking at the Quad Cities, or if you're looking at Springfield, Illinois, or St. Louis, Missouri, like we're in between all of that.
Yeah.
In that rural area.
Well, now some of the things that we want to talk about is a little bit of history today. And maybe if this is your first time seeing Jerry, I think you're in for a treat. I know the first time I think I heard you speak on some of this stuff was down in Dallas at Barry Cameron's church. And I know I'd spent 5 years at Bible college, taking no less than 18 to 23 hours a semester to graduate with a BA and pastoral ministry and a minor in youth. And I hadn't heard some of the things that you were talking about. And it's not surprising. You don't learn everything in Bible college and you got to continue to study. But some of the things that you had to say. Now, I think it being Black History Month, I got some friends whose dads are pastors in inner city Chicago and who go to Cross the Line Church. And they were really excited about hearing some things today, maybe watching it later as well with some groups about some of the things that kind of the history of the Restoration movement and the ties in with the Civil Rights movement and Fred Gray. And you wrote, you interviewed him and wrote an article in the Christian Standard. And could you there are a lot of people that will watch this. I think there's, last week there's a couple thousand people that watched it all the way through by the end of the week. And I don't think any of them have heard what you can tell us. So could you just start telling us about some of that? So cool.
So I got to do something, you probably don't know this, Austin, but I got to do something really cool because I got into this whole thing. I was invited to speak at Cane Ridge on the 220th anniversary of the revival at Cane Ridge.
Wow.
And that was like August. It was the first week or the second week of August this last summer. And really, really cool experience. I've been there before, but to actually be able to speak in the pulpit and have the place full of people, and they're worshiping and there were 2 other speakers there. One was Bob Russell, and the other one was Doug Foster, Dr. Doug Foster. And Foster teaches at Abilene Christian University, and he's he knows everything about the Restoration movement. Like he's written all these textbooks and then Bob Russell's kind of the golden oracle. And I was the first guy to get up, so I had to get up, and Doug Foster's in the very center of the lower part of the gallery, and then I look up because when you have to step up into this pulpit. When I look up in the very center of the balcony area, there's Bob Russell. So no pressure at all. And I had this opportunity to speak. Well, since we're talking about Black History Month, it was interesting that for people that don't know about Cane Ridge was the seminal moment of the Second Great Awakening. And there were a ton of things that changed in American culture as a result of that. I mean, it's out in the middle of nowhere, Bourbon County, Kentucky, and 20,000 people met there in the rain and for like a week. And there were things that happened there that had never happened before, because these guys were Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, and all Calvinistic kind of belief. And I mean, they were having altar calls. There was no such thing as that before then. People were trying to figure out how, and it was used for crowd control. So it was like interesting stuff. Well, there were a lot of other interesting things about Cane Ridge. One was this was 1801. So this is 60 years before the Civil War. And it was an integrated church in Kentucky.
Wow.
Yeah. So like when you think about the Restoration movement, a lot of times you don't think about it with in the context of race relations or racial reconciliation, but that was actually a fact. Now it was interesting. There's no stairway to get up into. There wasn't at the time a stairway to get up into the balcony of Cane Ridge. And if you were Black, you had to sit in the balcony, and if you were white, you could sit down on the main floor. So it was still segregated, but they were able to actually worship in the same space. And people that went up in the balcony, African Americans, had to climb a ladder and go through a window. Wow. And it was a major deal for them to actually put a stairway in. So, I mean, but at the time, in 1801, in Kentucky, that was a really bold move for Blacks and whites to actually worship in the same worship space and sing the same songs and hear the same sermon. So, pretty cool. Just to give you an idea of how important that moment was, historically, in 1801, 15% of the American population went to church. 15%, 1-5. After Cane Ridge, it went to 50. Can you imagine if that were to happen today?
We need another one of those, don't we?
Yeah.
And when you talk about the Restoration movement, some people that watch this have no idea what the Restoration movement is. So I just maybe have you summarize. Obviously, if you go to Cross the Line Church, we're an independent Christian church, but there's a whole bunch of groups that consist of the Restoration movement that we basically identify with as a church. So I just want
the Restoration movement is a movement that is based on being unified on the basis of the most primitive form of Christianity, which would be New Testament Christianity. So if you read Acts 2:41 to Acts 2:47, from 3,000 being baptized until how they were experiencing life in community, that is really the blueprint of what it means to be Restoration movement. It means we don't want to live according to human traditions or according to creeds, and have denominational hierarchies and anything like that. The kind of religious government that denominational churches have. We just wanted to be Christians, and that based on the New Testament. So if you were to boil it all down, that's what it means. It means to restore. Restoration means to restore the church to that pure form. And some people would call it a primitive form. That doesn't mean that you don't have electric light. I mean, what it means is that you're trying to capture a bit of the spirit of that first century church, and that was what was happening in Cane Ridge. So I guess that's what would be my best explanation of what it means to be a Restoration Movement church. Nobody can tell you what to do. All leadership is local.
That's why you like it, right?
Our own elders and our own pastors, and which I kind of like as well.
Yeah.
And I think we all do. And then like you said, there are different streams of that movement. Now, I'm going to move into the racial stuff that you wanted me to talk about, because I think you and I both have ties to a church extension foundation called the Solomon Foundation.
Yeah.
And we had the opportunity. I was on the board when it was first established, and we had the opportunity to meet some people in the African American Churches of Christ. So we would call ourselves independent Christian, which means we're pretty conservative, fundamental, and but we use a musical instrument. And then there are non-instrumental or a cappella Churches of Christ that don't use musical instruments, and there's a whole discussion on why that is. And then there is an African American Church of Christ, which would be it would be mostly a black stream of Restoration Movement churches, which I was not very familiar with. One of the things about being independent is you can become isolated and not know what other people are doing or what's going on. But because of that relationship, I started meeting some people and hearing some names, and I started doing some research. And that was happening, at the same time I became the publisher of the magazine. And I heard about a man that was revered in the African American Church of Christ. I've never heard his name before. His name was Marshall Keeble. And I made friends with a guy in one of the African American Churches of Christ named David Johnson. And we would spend hours together, and he would talk to me about Marshall Keeble. Here's what I found out. If I were to tell you, and I've come up to people before and I've said, tell me a person's name, a preacher in a Restoration Movement church that baptized over 45,000 people, started over 350 churches. You should know who that guy is.
Yeah.
And I couldn't get anybody to answer that question. His name's Marshall Keeble. And the reason I didn't know what his name was or what he had done is for two reasons. One, he was non-instrumental Church of Christ. Number two, he was black. And I'm not talking about a guy that's in ancient history. This guy, I think he died in 1968. So, and he was in his 80s at the time. Started Nashville Christian Institute and did some amazing things in his life. And his story is an incredible story. I would really encourage your listeners to do some study on Marshall Keeble. You can get on YouTube and you can hear his sermons.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because some of them were recorded like on audio. And he's got one about baptism, talking about going down into the water. It's a powerful sermon. The guy was an incredible preacher of God's word, and he wanted to develop the church. David told me, he goes, the reason that you wonder how would a guy start that many churches? he goes, well, in the South, African Americans in the South, many of them were sharecroppers, and most of them didn't have the ability to read or write. And Marshall would go down there and he would hold a revival. And a lot of times they were like brush arbor revivals. They were out in the open air. And when he would preach, literally everyone that came to hear him, every single one of them would accept Christ, and he baptized them.
Wow.
So he'd have 300 or 400 come. He'd baptize 300 or 400. Then he'd gather them all together, and he goes, which one of you guys can read? Somebody raise their hands. Yeah, I can read. He goes, you're the preacher.
That's what Manhattan Christian College was doing in the 90s. That's how I got into ministry.
Yeah. So pretty amazing how he developed churches, and then he would go back around and help them establish elders. But that's how the a big part of how the African American Church of Christ developed and grew. Well, Marshall Keeble's an incredible story. I had COVID 10 days ago, so that's what you're hearing.
All right.
Second time.
Back around for you.
Anyway, so Marshall would have these young men that he would travel with. He called them his preacher boys. And I did a cover on Christian Standard. I had a picture of him surrounded by 4 of those boys. And so I did some research on those 4 guys. And one of them is a gentleman named Fred Gray. Now, I had no idea who he was. And but I was interested in just finding out more about this commonality that I have with my brothers in the African American Church of Christ. So I studied all those guys, and I studied Fred Gray, and I found out that Fred Gray was one of the most key figures in the civil rights movement. He was from excuse me. He was from Montgomery, Alabama, but you couldn't get an education there if you were black. So when he was still a boy, they sent him up to Nashville to go to Marshall Keeble's school. And Marshall Keeble taught him a lot of, basic things, basic life skills, and got him in God's word and got him preaching and took him around and taught him how to live out of a suitcase and to just be ready in season and out of season to preach the gospel. Well, while he was at the Institute, he developed a real passion for desegregation. And his words were, I wanted to destroy every form of segregation I could find. And he developed that mentality when he was a teenager. And after he graduated from that school, he got his college degree, and then he had to go up to, I think it was Cleveland, Ohio, to get a law degree. He wanted to become a lawyer to follow this passion of desegregation. Now, the entire time he was doing that, he was preaching. So he would preach as an elder in a church, or as the minister of the church, but then was pursuing his law degree. Well, he got his degree, passed the bar, moved back to Alabama, and opened a law office in Montgomery. Well, he was just a kid, so I think he was 25 at the time, maybe 24. He was not married at the time, and his law office was right around the corner from a department store. And there was a single lady that worked in the department store as a seamstress, and they would have lunch together. And she was also a youth leader at the local chapter of the NAACP. and asked Fred if he would help her work with the kids at the local chapter of the NAACP. And he said, sure. About the same time, there was a 15-year-old girl. Her name was Claudette Colvin. And in Montgomery, Alabama, they had segregated buses. And kids, black kids, they went to black schools, and they had to ride city buses to get home. But the law was they had to ride in the back of the bus, and if the bus got full, you had to give your seat up to a white passenger. Well, the time where Claudette would get on the bus, normally there was plenty of room. But one day, school let out early. So she had to get on the bus early to get back home. And she was sitting on the bus, and the bus got full, and then someone requested her seat. She didn't want to give it up. She was afraid. She was, like, what am I going to do? I'll be on a bus stop in an area that I don't know. And she was young. And anyway, because she did not want to give her seat up on the bus, they arrested her and put her in jail. They called Fred Gray, and he got her out. He got her out of jail. Well, then he was having lunch, and he was discussing this with his friend that he did volunteer work with the youth group of the NAACP, and they thought they ought to do something about it. And so they had a meeting in I think her last name was Robinson, her house. and I'm going to put all this together, okay? The seamstress's name that worked in the department store that had lunch with Fred Gray regularly, her name was Rosa Parks. And so they decided that Rosa Parks was going to get on a bus, and it was going to be when it was a time when a lot of white people would be riding the bus. She was not going to give up her seat off the bus, and this was developed because of what they experienced with Claudette Colvin. And then she was going to go to jail, and then Fred was going to get her out of jail. They were going to use that to do a thing called the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And it was supposed to last one day. And it was just to do a bus walkout where all the African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama were not going to ride the bus. So that was the big plan. But they needed a spokesman, and it couldn't be Fred, because if it was Fred Gray, he would be disbarred. Mm-hmm. So they're sitting in this living room, this lady, her last name's Robinson, and they're talking about who can we get. And there were some big civil rights leaders in Montgomery back then. One guy's name was E.D. Nixon. He's a pretty famous guy. A lot of these guys were voting rights, more about voting rights than they were about desegregation. And they talked about it, and they couldn't come up with anyone that they thought would be really the right person for that. And then the lady whose house they were in said, we just got a brand new preacher. He's young, but he can move people with words. And Fred said, I've heard that he's in town. And, if you think that he would be willing to do it, I'm willing for him to be the spokesman. And that person was Martin Luther King. Mm-hmm. And at the time, I think he was 24. So these people were all in their early to mid 20s. And they came up with this Montgomery bus boycott. And that thing that was supposed to last one day, I think lasted like 382 days. Wow. And basically broke the back of the city when it came to segregation on public transportation. So when you think about the civil rights movement, a lot of times you think about Dr. Martin Luther King. You think about Rosa Parks. And you might think about the Montgomery Bus Boycott. You might think about the Selma to Montgomery March. The person behind all of that was Fred Gray. And Fred Gray was a pastor in the African American Church of Christ the whole time. Never stopped preaching. The whole time he was doing all this law work, he was preaching at the same time. And there was a lot of things that people tried to do to disbar him, to get him out. Most every case that he took to court, he lost all the way up to, and then would appeal and lose, and then would appeal again and lose. And he would appeal all the way to the Supreme Court. And when he got to the Supreme Court, he'd win. So a lot of his victories in the United States Supreme Court they're all required reading if you get into constitutional law. Fred Gray's responsible for all those things I mentioned, the thing with Rosa Parks, the thing with, and Martin Luther King. He was Martin Luther King's lawyer until King left Montgomery and went to Atlanta. He didn't go, they wanted him to go to Atlanta, but he wanted to stay in Montgomery, Alabama. And he continued to fight for desegregation in Alabama. He was responsible for desegregation of Alabama schools. I think the case law was Browder versus Gale. He was responsible for the desegregation of Alabama universities. You may remember the whole thing with George Wallace standing at the door saying of the schoolhouse, saying that little girl couldn't go in. And, it was because he fought with Fred Gray. As a matter of fact, George Wallace and Fred Gray knew each other really well. And they argued in court oftentimes and actually respected one another. All of this that I'm telling you is in a book that he wrote called Bus Ride to Justice. It's an incredible book. He was one of the greatest champions of the civil rights movement. If you ever see the movie Selma, Cuba Gooding Jr. plays Fred Gray in that movie. He's also responsible to argue to the Supreme Court the Tuskegee syphilis study. And if you don't know what that was where basically African American men were used as lab rats to see the effects of syphilis. So they were being told they were being treated when they weren't being treated. And it was horrible abuse. I was actually talking to a guy in Arizona about 2 weeks ago. I was at Chad Goucher's church and I was teaching on restoration history. And an African American guy came up to me afterwards and he goes, "Do you know why the African American community has been very reluctant to get COVID vaccines? The Tuskegee syphilis study. We don't trust the government." Because that was the government that did that to us.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, I never put that together. I never, never really thought that that difference of those people that would be willing to get a vaccine for COVID or not get a vaccine for COVID could actually be related to civil rights and that work. Anyway, I'm telling you all this stuff.
That's what we want.
Yeah. So I get a call from Doug Foltz, who works for TSF, and he's working with an African-American pastor named Andrew Hairston, who's also a judge. And I believe that's in Atlanta. And they were naming the street after him, and he's also a big deal in the civil rights movement from Atlanta perspective. Well, Andrew Hairston is really close friends with Fred Gray. And Doug Foltz said, "Hey, what would you think if I could get Andrew Hairston to ask Fred Gray if he would be willing to give you an interview? And I said, that would be incredible. I would love to interview him. Because, well, he's going to be speaking at Lipscomb University. If you want to go down there, maybe I can arrange it. Was interesting. He was real standoffish about, because he just doesn't give interviews. And he's, at the time, I think he was in his late 80s. He's maybe 87. And but we kind of kept working it, and he goes, all my kids, he actually called me on the phone. He goes, all my kids told me not to do this interview, but for some reason I just feel like I ought to do it. So I got to drive down to Lipscomb University. He was speaking there. It was interesting who he was speaking with. He was speaking with Janice Rogers Brown. And you may not know that name, but it was in the news like 2 days ago. Because right now there's this big push happening. Joe Biden is saying that he's going to put the first African-American female on the U.S. Supreme Court, right? But what you may not know is that George W. Bush nominated Janice Rogers Brown for the U.S. Supreme Court, and some people voted against her. One of those was Senator Joe Biden, which is interesting. So, not the first woman nominated. She was the first woman nominated to the Supreme Court and rejected because of her political positions, probably being more on the conservative side. Well, Janice Rogers Brown was at Lipscomb too. She was speaking, and both her and Fred Gray spoke together. And it was interesting because she gets up, and she was in the Court of Appeals, and she said, the reason I got into law was because of that man right there. He's my idol. And it's really kind of neat how it's all intertwined. It's not like you talk about Restoration history like it's some dusty old thing about a bunch of dead people that we don't care about anymore, but it is right up in your face. Like it's happening right now in current events when you think about how the Restoration movement has impacted culture. And definitely did through the Civil Rights Movement because of that stream of the Restoration Movement, the African American Churches of Christ. Anyway, it was after he did his lecture there, I got the opportunity to sit down with him and interviewed him. And it was the most amazing interview I've ever conducted. The guy hadn't lost a single memory. Way better at his memory than I am. And it was just incredible to hear him recount his humility. He was a very, very close friend of John Lewis, who just passed away, the congressman, and was at his funeral. He has a museum in Tuskegee, Alabama, that recounts the syphilis study primarily. But I would really encourage you to read that book, Bus Ride to Justice. It's an incredible story about an incredible man who has loved the Lord Jesus his whole life, dedicated his life to destroying segregation, and the underpinnings of that he learned in his relationship with Jesus Christ. And it came under the tutelage of Marshall Keeble. And just absolutely incredible, absolutely beautiful story. And there's just tendrils of that go out in incredible ways. And I tell you what, it makes me so sad to think that we could go our whole life and not know that we had champions in the civil rights movement. And we had champions in the civil rights movement goes all the way back to abolition. The whole reason I got started in this whole thing, because I took Restoration History in Bible college, and it was horrible. It was at 7 a.m. in the morning. It was the most boring class I was ever, couldn't stand it.
Yeah.
And I got my grade, and then got out. It wasn't until we opened up our fourth location in Hannibal, Missouri. And when we opened up that location, I'm trying to remember how I found out about this. I found out that Barton Stone, the guy from the Cane Ridge Revival, died in Hannibal, Missouri. And I'm like, Hannibal, Missouri? I mean, you know how far Cane Ridge is from Hannibal, Missouri? I thought he was in Cane Ridge. Well, turns out in 1833, he left Kentucky and moved to Illinois, Jacksonville, Illinois. And he did it because he wanted to be on the American frontier, sharing the gospel, and he was completely opposed to slavery. And he wanted to get, and Kentucky's a slave state. It was at the time. And he wanted to get out of that state and that environment. So he came to Jacksonville. When you drive on I-74, you go through Jacksonville 72 that becomes 74. You drive right by his farm, and the house is still there.
Wow.
Where he lived from 1833 to 1844. So he had a stroke. He was an old man, 77, 78. He went to Columbia, Missouri for a preacher's conference, 1844. On the way back, he got really sick. He made it as far as Hannibal, where his daughter Amanda lived. And he died in Hannibal in his daughter's house. His wife, Celia, couldn't run the farm without him. So they took his body and buried him on the farm, but she couldn't care for the farm. So she sold the farm. They exhumed his body. They buried him in the Jacksonville cemetery. And then she moved to Hannibal to live with her daughter, Amanda. They had 6 kids, and but lived with Amanda and her husband, Captain Bowen. And she died there 13 years later in 1857. And she was buried in Hannibal. So I went up on Cardiff Hill, where there's a really old cemetery right by the river. And went looking through the cemetery, and I found her stone. And it was broken, and you couldn't read it. But if you chalked it, you could read who it was. It was Celia Stone, says wife of Elder B.W. Stone. And anyway, so our church paid the money to buy her a new stone that says the same thing as the old stone, and put a plaque commemorating who she was and what they did. And that's up there today. Anyway, this was in 2011. I never wrote for anybody other than for sermons. And I was really moved by her story. And so I wrote an article called Rediscovering the Sacred Stones. And I submitted it to Christian Standard. And then they published it. And there was a lot more research that went into that. Well, I after finding out that Barton Stone died in Hannibal, I found out that Alexander Campbell came the next year just to stand in the room where Barton Stone died. And then he came back later and he preached a revival in Hannibal. And there was a kid that was about 12 years old in the crowd named Samuel Clemens or Mark Twain. And Alexander Campbell, they wanted to have a copy of his sermon because it was so big sermon, and Mark Twain worked as a typesetter in the print shop, and so they had to set print for Alexander Campbell's sermon. He wrote about that sermon, and he wrote about the day he saw it, and he said something like, "I didn't realize there was such a great amount of people in the world when you get them all together." That's how many. There was such a great crowd to hear Alexander Campbell in Hannibal,
Wow.
which was this little village. So anyway, they were setting the type, and it was a Friday, and they all wanted to go fishing, and they didn't have enough room at the very end to put Jesus Christ, because that's how he ended his speech. And so they put J.C. Well, then Alexander Campbell goes to the print shop, and he's proofreading it, and he gets all mad because they just did, initials for Jesus Christ. And he got lit up, like mad, and told them that they had to change it. And it made the printers mad. So what they did was they literally reset the whole thing and changed it to Jesus H. Christ, which is like a and it's absolute truth. It's like, and the reason I know this is because Mark Twain wrote this. Okay.
Oh my
He
word.
wrote about this because that's where, like, if you want to know where the term, the pejorative term, like the swear word,
They got yelled at me a few times.
It came from an Alexander Campbell sermon. And then they all went fishing, so Alexander Campbell couldn't get mad at him again. I would love to find the pamphlet. I would give so much to have one of those. But anyway, one more thing about that little part of the story. So Cardiff Hill may be a term. If you've ever read Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn, you've probably read about Cardiff Hill and that cemetery where I found Celia Stone, because in the story of Tom Sawyer, the story is that Injun Joe kills Doc Robinson in a cemetery, and then a guy named Muff Potter gets blamed for it, and Tom Sawyer is up behind a tree, and he sees it happen, and then he testifies against Injun Joe, who then jumps out the window, and that's all part of the story of Tom Sawyer. What you don't know is that Mark Twain's best friends were Barton and Will Bowen, Barton Stone's grandsons. And the characters of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn are based on Barton Stone's grandsons. And they stayed friends with them. He stayed friends with them his whole life till he died. They wrote each other frequently. And all these stories I'm telling you are in Mark Twain's memoirs. It's incredible. Now, there's nobody could, I think, accuse Mark Twain of being a Christian man, but he was best friends with a lot of Christian people. So, very interesting. Anyway, that fascinated me. So then I would go to board meetings of the Solomon Foundation, and I would start telling them these stories. Hey, guess what I found out? Guess what I found out? Well, then when we found out that the Christian Standard was going to go belly up, the board said, that can't happen. That's our legacy. That's who we are. That's our history. Well, they go, well, who's going to run the thing? And then they all looked at me because I'd been this guy telling them all these stories. So they go, you need to be the guy. So that's how I got. Sorry.
It's all right.
That's how I got stuck with the job. Anyway, so we've completely redone the Christian Standard, and now it's, Christian Standard Media, and it's a little something I do while I've been running the church. So I just did a long talk, a long download. You can ask questions now.
Oh, no, I mean, it's just incredible. I think what people don't understand, and I had no idea, is how how people come into the churches, however, right? But the fact that we get to be a part of a movement that first, I mean, and you can correct me if I missed this, but you say at the that first revival that we talked about, that church attendance went from 15% to 50% in America.
Yeah, in the whole country in a very short period of time. The Second Great Awakening completely changed the entire profile of America. The whole culture was changed because of that.
And you're in what people might not have caught is at that first the Second Great Awakening, at that revival, you had Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell. And from that, if we move on and kind of what we're, I guess, at least part of what we're talking about, you have Barton Stone moving to where he did because, listen, he's because of Christ and his understanding of the Bible. Hey, I hate slavery. I'm out. So he moves, and then on down the road, we get Keebler, Fred Gray, the civil rights. I mean, really, some of the most important stories that anybody ever learns about the civil rights movement, and that's the heritage. And what I think is interesting is sometimes, I don't know, when I graduated from Bible college, and sometimes in an independent Christian church, Christ Church of the Valley, how many ever churches that we are, sometimes it's you don't come out of Bible college, at least I didn't, knowing most of that. I mean, even the story, even the stuff you're talking about with Tom Sawyer, those stories, and how, man, those are Barton Stone's grandkids. That's fun stuff to know. That's stuff that you could just want to research and geek out on for long periods of time. But also, I guess, just to preach and teach the gospel in the churches of the Restoration movement, knowing that that's the heritage that we're coming from, and really walking into. And some of these guys are still alive. I just think is a great testimony to faith. And I'm just, when I heard this stuff the first time, I mean, it's like, you might have thought that was a long download. I'm sitting here thinking like that's 5 minutes and I want to hear more, because it's just stuff that, you don't hear every day. And I have friends who I told about this, that you would talk, and I knew some of these stories from being at conferences where you've been able to share this with pastors who, by and large, had no idea.
Right.
I mean, it's not that probably guys knew about it and didn't talk about it in Bible college, or that they just don't know. And you pointed out some reasons. Here's why we don't know. And the fact that we do get to know, and maybe I think it's had these stories that you were able to tell. Now the Solomon Foundation, their mission is to put so much money towards those churches that maybe, would have no chance to get a building or a loan or anything like that. And so now they're growing churches like crazy, and we get to see that every week. And so I think that's cool. I think there's a question about what is the Christian Standard or Christian Standard Media. Well, Christian Standard is the magazine that every Christian church, used to get. I don't know how many subscribe today, and it was failing. And you went to a storage unit, right, and got a whole bunch of the history, like basically saved the history of the Christian church almost, right? Could you tell just a few minutes on that?
Yeah, pretty crazy. So Christian Standard it came first. So it's the seventh oldest continually published magazine in the United States. I mean, you think of like Harper's Bazaar, or like some of these, like the oldest magazine. It's like one of its first. The first edition was March 1866, and it's been continually published since then. So it came right out of the Civil War. And the people that started the Standard were some of the most powerful people in America, even the world. You've probably heard of some of them. There was a guy named, there were two brothers whose last name were Phillips, and they owned the Phillips Petroleum Company. There was a guy named Streeter who owned B&O Railroad. There was a guy named Yost who invented the typewriter. And there was another guy named James Garfield who became president of the United States. He was a congressman at the time. And they got in a room together and they said, because when you think about Reconstruction after the Civil War, so many young men had been killed, 750,000. And churches burnt to the ground. And they were saying somebody has to raise a standard that people can run to, like a battle flag. And that's why it's called Christian Standard, because somebody said that statement in that room up in Cleveland, Ohio. Someone needs to raise a standard. And they got a guy who was a president of a college named Isaac Errett to come and start it. And he did for 2 years. And then some of these guys wanted to back out because it was expensive. And so Isaac Errett bought the magazine and then developed it. And in 1872, he started the Standard Publishing Company. And the Standard Publishing Company was where every independent Christian church got their stuff for like 100 years, right?
Right.
Whether you're talking about, they invented the flannel graph. I mean, I grew up with little old ladies putting like little figures up on a flannel graph. They invented color printing for churches. They were the first ones to do, like, they're real innovative. Anyway, it was privately owned and it was a for-profit company for many years. And then eventually it was sold off, and a venture capital company bought it, I think in like 2005 or 6. And what they did was they took it all apart and sold everything off except the magazine. And they were just going to let the magazine die. And that's when Solomon Foundation came in and said, we aren't going to let it die. And we're going to go from being a for-profit to a not-for-profit. And so that's what it is now. So anyway, we're trying to make this thing cash flow positive, so that's the other part that I get out of this deal. And I decided to do a lot of risky things. One of them is I made the magazine free online. So like all these stories I'm telling you right now, if you get on christianstandard.com, you can read every one of them and a whole lot more. It's incredible stuff. Over the last 5 years, you can read some incredible stories about the civil rights movement, about Marshall Keeble, about Fred Gray, a lot of other really good stories. But anyway, that all of those resources are 100% free online. And you can still buy the magazine. It's a great coffee table magazine, but it's like $25 a year if you want that.
Yeah, we have that.
So anyway, we're trying to make ends meet. And Renee Little, who was with Solomon Foundation, says, we've got this bill, this reoccurring bill on our books. It's a storage unit in Cincinnati. I have no idea what they got in there. It's probably a bunch of old display things or something. Because you go over there and get it cleaned out and throw the stuff away so we can get rid of this fee. It was like $200 or $300 a month. So I went, okay. So I drove over there in my truck, and then I had some of the guys that I had hired meet me there, and we opened this thing up, and it was like Indiana Jones. It's crazy. It's like opening up a tomb. It's like a combination of Raiders of the Lost Ark and Storage Wars. It's crazy. So like there are these big oil paintings of Isaac Errett and Russell Arrett and these Restoration Fathers and all kinds of stuff in there. Every issue of Christian Standard, every issue of Lookout Magazine, every issue of Radar, every issue of Junior Life, all of these magazines that they'd done. And what it was Standard Publishing had a library and like an archive. And when they sold, it was a huge building. It was 6 acres under roof. When they sold that building, Wicks did, they had to figure out where to put all the stuff that was in the library. There was all these first editions of books that Standard had printed. Well, it all went in that storage unit. So, it was nuts, the stuff I found in there. So I had to hire a semi-trailer, had to have it loaded. I brought it all back to Quincy. We have a building downtown, and I built a library in that building to house all this. And you can't believe stuff I found. I don't know if you've ever heard of Lloyd Pelfer. He used to be the president of Central College of the Bible in Moberly.
Okay.
And he knows everything you can know about Restoration Movement. Pretty old guy. He's still alive, but trouble getting around. And David Fincher, the president, brought him here to look at the stuff that he could hold it with his own hands. And it was so much fun having him up there. I go, you want to see Isaac Errett's personal daily diary?
Oh, that's
in his own handwriting.
Huh.
Yeah. So I would be going through envelopes and just boxes. I found this one manila envelope, said 1800s on it. Opened it up. And here is the original prospectus of the Millennial Harbinger. So I don't know if you know, the Millennial Harbinger was the periodical, the magazine that Alexander Campbell did. And a lot of kids in Bible college, they thought it was really cool to buy all of the volumes of the Millennial Harbinger. But this was the actual prospectus, where he asked the government permission to print it. And I've got that. And then I found the one for the Christian Baptist, which was the magazine he did before the Millennial Harbinger, in 1832. And I turned it around on the back, and there's his signature. Alexander Campbell's signature. A. Campbell. He never signed Alexander. He always signed A. Campbell. I found Jenny Errett was Isaac's daughter, and she was good friends with Lucretia Garfield, the First Lady of the United States. And so I've got notes that Lucretia Garfield wrote to Jenny Errett on her mourning stationery when she was mourning the assassination of the president. All this stuff, it was all in, and there's so much more. But it's just absolutely incredible. It's our history. It's who we are.
Right.
Millions and millions and millions of words that people wrote about our movement. And we come from an incredibly rich history. We have a great story. It's not boring. It's interesting. You just need to be a good storyteller. And I don't know what it is about restoration history professors, but I just don't think they're that good at storytelling.
Well, it probably at 7 a.m. I probably wasn't ready to hear it either. But I think ours was 8 at MPC. But I probably wasn't trying to listen after a weekend of basketball or whatever. I wasn't trying to sit in that class. But what I want to encourage people to do is first of all, get online. It's free online, Christian Standard. And one of the things that you can do is I think you can just honor God and just by understanding the history of what God's done in our country. First of all, moving, and of course I got to hear some of these stories before. So sometimes when Jerry was asking, "Have you heard this name?" Well, I had, but it was just from him in a speech, and a talk, maybe with the Solomon Foundation or something like that. And so I've been very blessed to learn And we get the Christian Standard at our coffee shop at Cross the Line. It's called the Front Porch. And instead of having a foyer to empty into, we have a coffee shop area called the Front Porch. And we have the Christian Standard out there for people to read. Featured some of the ones that you talked about. We have those right on top. So because I think we're proud of the work of Fred Gray, many of the guys that you talked about. I think it's a rich heritage, and I would encourage people to go to the Christian Standard website and look these articles up and take some time to just understand the rich history. And also to know that if you go to a Christian church somewhere, because we have a lot of people watching in different places, you go to a Christian church or a Restoration Movement church, this is the rich history. And this month, as we celebrate Black History Month, that really this comes from understanding what God's word says about people and their value. And I think that's something that everybody, this movement is about unity, and the history of it is unity, but it's also freedom and things like that. So thanks, Jerry, for bringing this to us. I mean, I could listen to you talk about this stuff for a couple more hours, and maybe we can have you back on to do that. But I know you got things to do. And thanks for sharing, even though you'd had COVID recently and all that. But we love to hear you talk. I already have some comments on some things here that people are loving to hear you talk. So thanks so much for coming. And guys, we'll be back again next week. Sorry, I know that some of you have emailed me Bible questions and stuff. We do Biblical Worldview to help you with your ministry, to help you win people to Christ. And so next week, we're going to take some time to answer some of your questions from the last several weeks. But thanks, Jerry Harris. And we're so glad you joined us today because, man, that was good stuff. So if you just joined us at the end, we're going to leave these up, and you can watch these as long as you want. They'll be on, there's 2 on YouTube, 3 on Facebook, and 1 on Twitter. So we're trying to cover the bases, and we'll add some more as the week to come. All right, guys, thanks so much. I think I'm